Let me tell you a story. A while back, a few years ago, this was when my kids were about this age and this age and this age, because that's how fathers do it. We just kind of go by how tall they are, or if we've got multiple children, we add their ages together and give somebody one number. Someone says, "How old are your kids?" 32. Saves room in our brain. So back in the day when my children were younger, I was traveling and it was in the middle of winter. So I don't know, maybe December, something like that. And I was going to be gone for 3 or 4 days. We were getting ready to step really hard and heavy into the holiday season. And I asked my junior high son, Christopher, if he would take these really cool candles that I just bought and put them in the front windows of our house. So we've got about 18 or 20 windows in the front of our house. And when you come down to our house, you drive down a long hill, and the house sits at the bottom of this kind of valley area. And it's surrounded by 100-foot cedar trees. And the house is brown with nice trim. It's got a fireplace off to the right and a bunch of windows in the front. And it's kind of a welcoming environment. And we really like it when people come over and visit. It's just a warm, welcoming kind of place. So to enhance that, I asked my son Christopher to put these candles that I had purchased, which had timers and batteries in them, in all these front windows, or in most of those front windows, so that people, when they would come over, would feel welcomed when they visited our house. So you'd pull up and you'd see this warm a Pacific Northwest setting. Kind of looks like a little bit of a lodge nestled back in the trees, and it would make you feel warm and welcome. And so he said, okay, so as a junior higher would. And so I left, went off on my trip, and came back about 3 days later. And as I was driving home, I was really looking forward to a warm welcome after having been gone for a few days. It was an intense trip, so I was looking forward to enjoying my home and enjoying my family. And so stay with me on this brief story, because you might think I'm a little crazy with the set of expectations that I had as I was coming home. I expected that the lights would be on in the house, and I was getting home at about 4:30 or 5 in the evening from a trip across the country. And in the Pacific Northwest in the wintertime, sun sets actually around 4:30, and it's dark by about 5 o'clock. So about the time it was getting dark, I was coming home, and I'm expecting that the lights are going to be on in the windows in the front of the house. I also expected that as I drove down the hill and came up the driveway into the house, I would look off to the right and I would see smoke coming out of the chimney, and it would be a nice warm feeling. I also expected, as I gathered my luggage and came through the front doors and stepped into the entryway, that my 3 children would greet me right there, one right after the other. And they would say something like, "Hello, Father," having adopted some sort of a British accent. And they called me Dad, but for some reason I expected them to call me Father on this trip when I got home. I expected that I would look down into the living room from the entryway and see the fireplace aglow, and that I would hear some wonderful music playing on the sound system. Maybe something like Le Quattro Stagioni from Vivaldi, the Four Seasons, just playing lightly, wonderfully in the background. I expected that our Jack Russell Terrier would come running up and wag his little tail, and I'd pet him and he'd run off and do something. The children would go off about their day or their evening. Julie, my wife, would greet me with a nice warm drink of some sort, maybe something like this, but warm. Something nice smelling would be in the house, and I would come in and just feel so welcomed and just so glad that I was there. Well, this is not what happened. Even though I expected all of those things, none of those things actually happened. Here's what happened. When I turned at the top of the ridge down toward and looked down at the bottom of the long road leading up to my house, I noticed, first of all, that there were no lights in the windows. And so I felt this little pang of just a little zap of disappointment, just a little bit, not a big deal, just a little bit. As I pulled up to the house, tired, still all my expectations in place, I noticed that there was no smoke coming out of the fireplace. Clearly no fire was going on in the fireplace to warm the house. So, okay, just a little zap, not a big deal, 2 little strikes. Walked up to the house, opened the front door, stepped into the entryway, and as I touched the door and stepped into the entryway, I noticed there was a large noise going on the backside of the doors. Opened the doors and realized that my 3 children, who really never fought as they were growing up, this time were bending the curve. They were fighting right there in the entryway, just going at it, all 3 of them, my 2 sons and my daughter, right there going at it, running around them in a circle, circle was Jack Russell Terrier called Murphy, running in clockwise circle, barking, 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 and enjoying the fight as well. I saw that happen, still have my luggage in my hand. I glanced down, there's no fire in the fireplace. I noticed there was no Vivaldi playing on the sound system. The noise was awful. There was nothing warm and welcoming about that event at all. My wife came up out of the downstairs with her hair mangled as a mess, and she was holding a bunch of wet laundry and looked right at me, and her eyes turned from brown to yellow. She said, "You're home. They're yours." And she kicked past me, went out the front door, and I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "The dryer is broken. I told you it was about ready to break. I'm going next door, and I'm going to use their dryer." And boom, and she kicked the door shut behind her. I turned and looked at my 3 kids who were now still kind of going at it with each other, and I got angry. I said some words and made some gestures, and the children just scattered and ran off to other parts of the house. And I was irritated and angry, and we moved our way through the evening just like that. And when Julie came back, having left the laundry next door, she started making some kind of dinner, and we were all sitting down at dinner time, and we were bickering and going back and forth. And instead of these wonderful children that I had left, they had turned into these annoying little human beings. And they were spilling and arguing and going at it, and I got angrier and angrier and angrier. As the night went on, I got more and more irritable. Instead of tucking them into bed at night warmly, like I'm some wonderful father, I was actually cursing and sending them to their bedrooms. "Go to sleep, go to bed. I need some water. You can drink when you're 21. Go back to bed." I was really, really angry and really spun up as the night went on. The more disappointed, the more angry, the more frustrated I got. Of course, I was tired from the trip, but that was no excuse. After the children sniveled themselves to sleep at night, and I sat down in the living room, still kind of pouty and still kind of angry, and whipped open the newspaper, clutching it like this, looking at what had happened in the world while I was gone. I noticed at the top, looking at the top of the newspaper, I noticed my wife's hair moving back and forth in the living room, kind of like the dorsal fin of a shark, as it's kind of looking around. So she went back and forth, and then finally I moved the paper down, and she came over and sat down beside me, and she said, "What is your problem?" Of course, I responded in the way that any mature, loving man would. I said, "What is my problem? What do you mean what's my problem? It's not me, it's them. It's all this that I came home to." So Julie sat on the couch and turned sideways and pulled her feet up under her and leaned in and asked me this question: "What did you expect?" That question is an incredibly powerful question. It struck me. And until she had asked me the question, "What did you expect?" I hadn't really thought clearly about what I expected. All the things I just described to you, I had actually not really thought out in detail. So I answered her. I said, "Well, I expected when I got home that those lights would be in the front windows. And I expected it would all be lit up and warm." And then I folded my arms and sat back. She looked at me and she said, "You mean you're giving me all of this because your junior high boy forgot to put candles in the windows and turn them on?" And I said, "Well, it's not just that. It's not just that." So she said, "Well, what else did you expect?" So at that moment, I start realizing I had a whole bunch of expectations, kind of in layers, one after the other, that each one of them had been disappointed. And so I began to share with her what my expectations were, just like I told you this story. She didn't get to hear all of the expectations because, as I recall, partway through, her laughter hijacked the conversation. She thought I was a little nuts. What that did, though, for me, when I spelled out those expectations, was to help me answer that question: what did you expect? So we're going to come back to that story in a second. You're here because you are a leader, or you're a manager, or you are an influencer of people, or you're a supervisor. And you found out that over time that job is harder than you expected it would be. Well, what did you expect it to be? From that point on, I learned to ask myself that question: what are your expectations? And then I learned to ask a second question, which is really a powerful one. And you put these two questions together, and they become one of the most powerful tools you and I can use as leaders or managers or supervisors or influencers of people. What are your expectations? In details, in layers. And why is that important to you? Because at the core of all of our expectations are our values. As you recall, our values are the short description of those things that really, really matter to us. A value is like an engine or like a compass for us, or a mixture of those two things. A value is really a description of what matters most to us in life. To illustrate, money is not a value. Having a lot of money in your bank account, that's not a value. You have money in your bank account, in your mind, so that you can have security, for example. Or maybe you want money so that you can go have adventures. Well, security or adventure, now those are values. Money's not a value. So you get what the idea of values are. Our expectations are created by our values. So much so that I'd like to suggest to you that our expectations are like onions because they come in layers. And the outer layer of an onion is not all that useful. So when you ask someone else, what are your expectations? They'll give you the outer layer of the onion. It's clearly onion, but it's not all that useful. So you ask them again, and what else do you expect? And what else? And you find that the layered expectations, what we think something should be, come from something under the expectations. At the core of that onion of our layers are our values. That's why we ask two questions. What are your expectations? And what else, what else, what else? And why is that important to you? Because that helps us get to the values. I have learned in researching and working closely with leaders, thousands of leaders over 30 or 35 years, and then applying this in my own life, that these two questions are some of the most helpful questions I can possibly ask. I ask them when I'm at the beginning of something new. I also ask them when there's a change in something. So I could ask that of the people that I work closely with and care about. That might even be you. I may have asked you that question before, face to face or on the phone. I ask the question at the beginning of a meeting, or at the beginning of a new project, or at the start of a new company, or at the beginning of a new employment arrangement, the beginning of a contract, anything new. I ask the question, what are your expectations? And I don't wait, or I don't settle for the outer layer of the onion, which is, well, I expect some stuff and some things. We get what's under that layer. I expect this. Give me some details about what you expect. Then I'm not going to debate you as you tell me you expect this and this and this. I'm going to simply ask you, why is that important? Because the reason we do that is to find out if that expectation, which comes from a value, we don't ever want to change the value, is a realistic expectation. Because if the value is realistic, security is a realistic value, loving your family is a realistic value, having adventure and continual learning, those are realistic values. They're great values to have. But maybe how I expect that value to be demonstrated in this situation is not very realistic. So the reason I say, what are your expectations? And I ask that of myself and follow it with, why is that important to you? It's because I want to find out if the expectation in all of its detail is a realistic expectation. If it's not, then I can actually move that expectation. But I can't move it after it's been disappointed very easily. It's harder to do. If I can clarify my expectations before an event, before disappointment happens, then I can move them around so that they are more realistic expectations. So there's a lot of places you can use these two tools, these two questions. You can use this at the beginning of a staff meeting. What are your expectations? When you hire someone new, or you ask someone to step into a different role, or you give them a project, or they give you a project, you can say, well, let's talk about expectations. Now be careful. Don't settle for the outer layer of the onion. Get lower, get deeper, get more detailed about what expectations are. Because if we don't do that, and we step into the situation and discover that our expectations are disappointed, what we feel, what we experience is a disappointed expectation that feels like a threat to the value under the expectation. That's where our anger comes from. All of our anger, whether it's mild irritation or outright road rage or anything in between, all of our anger comes from disappointed expectations that we perceive are a threat to the value that created that expectation. Well, sidebar, not all of our anger. Some of our anger is induced by being hungry or being really, really tired. Some of it's just a pure biological anger where we find ourselves irritated. And as soon as you get a drink of water or you have some food or you take a nap, that anger goes away. So I'm not talking about that kind of anger, that irritability that happens just by being a tired human being. Not that at all. It's the kind of anger when you're fully awake and you're fully fed and you still get angry. That's the kind of anger I'm talking about. And again, you might say, oh, I never get angry. I never get angry. Well, then turn the dial down. Maybe it's just mild irritation. Maybe it's frustration that causes you to gossip about someone, that sort of thing. Maybe it's a real critical attitude that you've developed, which is that critical attitude is just anger. That's all it is. It's just turned way down on simmer. Where does it come from? It comes from this expectation that we've got that this value should look like this in this situation. I call this the power of expectations. So what are your expectations? And what else? And what else? Tell me more. And why is that important to you? Does that therefore enable us to say, well, how about if we change these expectations a little bit? Maybe that's not realistic, but this is, and it'll still meet that same value. When I had all those expectations about what it would be like when I came home, it was because I love my family and I want to be home with those kids after being gone for a while. I want to be able to rest in my own home. Those are all wonderful things. But what I thought it should look like, well, that wasn't all that realistic, to say the least. Fast forward, about 2 months later, something like that, I found that I was coming home after a trip, and by this point in time, after a few weeks, I had begun to practice this discipline. So what are your expectations? In advance of something, what are your expectations? And what else? And what else? Why is that important to you? Is that a realistic expectation? I'd begun practicing that as a discipline. And to this day, all these years later, I still practice this, and I teach this to all those who are a part of my teams. So I begun to practice that. And I have little kind of trigger places. I remember, like, I'll cross a street on my way home after being gone for a while. It's not necessarily every day, although maybe. But if I'm gone for a couple of days or it's something new, I'll cross a certain intersection. At that point, I ask myself, what are my expectations? And why is that important to me? So on this trip now, it's been a couple months, a few weeks later, after this event took place where I laid out what all my expectations were, and Julie laughed at me, and I realized, well, I kind of missed the boat there. As I turned around the corner and looked down the bottom of the hill, I asked myself, what do I expect? What do I expect? Okay. And I managed my expectations, pulled up to the front of the house, and I noticed all the lights. It's still winter. I noticed all the lights were on in the windows. I went, oh, huh. I hadn't asked again. This is now 2 months or so later. And parked in the driveway and walked around the entryway up to the front yard, up to the front door, and noticed that there was smoke coming out of the chimney. This is kind of cool. Opened the front door, and standing, I kid you not, in the entryway in my house, Von Trapp-style children in a row, tallest to shortest, were my 3 children. Seated at their feet was this Jack Russell Terrier named Murphy, which, if you know anything about Jack Russells, it's very difficult to get them to sit still. They're very nervous little dogs. I think Julie had given him some Baileys or something like that. So he was seated. They were all standing in a row. They were each holding something, like a pair of slippers that I didn't even own, and a newspaper or something like that. We're all holding something, and Murphy was seated, standing there in an apron that Julie had to borrow because she doesn't even own an apron. Is Julie with something warm to drink, hot cocoa or a coffee and Baileys, I don't know what it was. And as I walked in and surveyed this, and there's a fire in the fireplace, Vivaldi was actually playing. The place smelled wonderful from some bread that was being cooked. This all hit me, and as I stepped in, all 3 of my children said at the same time, "Welcome home, Father." And it was weird, to say the least. And of course, that scene only lasted about 10 seconds. And then they scampered away, went off to the rest of their house, and got into the basic chaos that it is when you're young children. Murphy ran off. Julie took this apron off, said she borrowed it, and we went on with our evening. But it was funny and weird. It was almost like a Stepford kind of situation. So perhaps my expectations, that little watercolor painting or that little movie that I had built in my head about what something should be and how other people should act and how therefore I should feel, all of which, by the way, came from a very good value, were unrealistic. Well, there you have it. I just wanted to share that with you because you'll find as a leader and as a manager and as a supervisor and influencer of people that sometimes we make our work harder than we need to. This tool, what are your expectations? Why is that important to you? Is that very realistic? Asked in advance of something new is a small change that you can make right away that makes a great big difference. So thank you very much for sticking around with us for these few minutes. And if you like this, how about going right down below there and hitting that like button? If you want to get more of these and you want to get notified, then hit the subscribe button, hit the bell. You know how that deal works. Thanks for hanging out for these few minutes. Take care.